Today I'm discussing Chapter 4 of No Man Knows My History. Welcome back to my No Man Knows My History series. Today I'm discussing Chapter 4, A Marvelous Work and a Wonder. We're going to talk about the translation of the Book of Mormon. We learn that Martin Harris is acting as scribe for Joseph Smith. And on page 50 we learn that he wants to at least see a copy of the engraved characters from the plates. He explained to Joseph, hey, we could go find an expert in Hebrew and he can tell me if these are real characters. And Joseph explained to him, well, they're not Hebrew. It's Reformed Egyptian. At this time, the Egyptian language was popularly believed to be indecipherable, for it was not until 1837 that the grammar worked out from the Rosetta Stone by the French scholar Champollion was first published in England. So Joseph was pretty safe saying it was Egyptian, or a Reformed Egyptian. So eventually he gave in. Eventually Joseph Smith gave in and let Martin Harris have a copy of some characters. Here you'll get two different stories. In the Saints books, it tells the story of Martin Harris taking them to a man named Charles Anthon, and the Anthon said, yes, these are real, and told him that he might want to go visit a man named Samuel Mitchell, who was more of an expert. In this book, it says that he went to Samuel Mitchell first, and Samuel Mitchell said, well, I don't know any of this, but go to Charles Anthon. He'll be able to tell you. This said that Mitchell gave Harris no satisfaction. He directed him to Charles Anthon, professor of Greek and Latin at Columbia College. Anthon wrote later that the paper consisted of all kinds of crooked characters disposed in columns and had evidently been prepared by some person who had before him at the time a book containing various alphabets, Greek and Hebrew letters, crosses and flourishes, Roman letters inverted or placed sideways. They were arranged in perpendicular columns, and the whole ended in a rude delineation of a circle divided into various compartments, decked with various strange marks and evidently copied after the Mexican calendar by Humboldt, but copied in such a way as not to betray the source whence it was derived. Martin Harris told Joseph that Anthon had pronounced the characters Egyptian, Chaldaic, Assyriac, and Arabic, and had given this opinion in writing. But then, after hearing the story of the angel and the golden plates, he'd torn up his own statement in disgust. When he heard that they were written on plates, he asked to have them brought to him, and then Harris said, well, part of it's sealed, and Anthon said, I cannot read a sealed book, which fulfilled some prophecy that Joseph Smith had said was going to happen. Anthon himself later denied all of this and said that he learned his name was being used to advertise the Book of Mormon, and he denied all of it. He said that he never said anything positive about these characters, that he did not say that they were in any way real characters. So that's going to be a he said situation. We don't know for sure. However, Joseph apparently felt that his Reformed Egyptian characters were a success, since he allowed them to be used later in a bold little circular advertising the Book of Mormon. This is a really interesting development because we have a copy of those characters that we can see. When you look at them, they do look like they are letters put sideways, numbers put sideways, weird little swirlies on different letters. It doesn't look that different than a normal English language. And in fact, Sandra and Gerald Tanner, who I've talked about before, wrote a note using a symbol from these different characters that is showing how you can write English words with the characters he created. You can see this from church sources, including the Joseph Smith papers. However, when the LDS Church made a video recently about the story, they did not use these characters in the picture. They used this picture instead. On page 53, she said that Martin Harris moved to Harmony expecting to relieve Emma of the task of taking Joseph's dictation. So Martin Harris now will become the scribe. The story is told that his wife came and she was looking around for things and snooping a lot. It also tells us that a blanket flung across a rope divided the room where they worked. On one side sat Joseph staring into his stones, and on the other was Harris writing at a table. Joseph warned his scribe that God's wrath would strike him down should he dare to examine the plates or look at him while he was translating. I don't hear this narrative anymore, but I did hear that when I was younger, that there was a blanket or something like that between them, some kind of a sheet between the scribe and Joseph. And so when people say, oh, he never had anything to look at, no books to look at or anything, papers or anything like that, how would they know? If they couldn't see Joseph or weren't allowed to look at him while he was translating, I don't know how they would know he didn't have anything that he was looking at. The fact that he put his head in a hat, I wouldn't be surprised if there was something in there he was reading too, but we don't know. We can't know that for sure. But I also don't know for sure if this narrative is true, because she tells it in here, and like I said, I was taught that. But they don't talk about it anymore. So I haven't been able to find definitive proof that there was a sheet at all times or even some of the time. So if you know anything more about that, leave it in the comments. So Joseph Smith and Martin Harris worked together for 2 months. At the end of this time, they had put together 116 pages. On page 54, she tells us how Harris wanted to take these 116 pages back to his wife to prove to her, because she was very skeptical. And as you would be, your husband, who, as we learn more about Martin Harris, you'll find that he joined lots of groups and he was always changing his mind. And so to her, it's just one more thing, one more group, one more religion he's joined. And she knows that they're mortgaging their farm and that he's giving up everything for this. I would want to know too. I'd want to see it too. So Joseph at first said no, but then he gives in and he lets him take the 116 pages. Well, this is speculation. She said Lucy Harris promptly stole the manuscript from her husband, and neither pleas nor blows could make her divulge its hiding place. We don't know for sure. I believe that is what happened. I believe that she wanted to test Joseph Smith, and so she threw it away or hid it or burned it or something, but it has never shown up since then. But that's another one of those things that we won't know. During this time, very sadly, Emma and Joseph's baby died. It's told that Emma was frantic about the pages. Joseph was getting frantic about the pages, so he left to go find Martin. And Lucy Smith wrote that when Joseph confronted his scribe, Martin Harris confessed his folly, that the pages had been lost, and said, "I have lost my soul, I have lost my soul." There's a lot of speculation in this chapter, because it's speculating that for sure his wife had stolen them or destroyed them or whatever, and also speculating what Joseph is thinking at this time. But what we do know is that he then had looked into the Urim and Thummim and received 2 long communications, which said in part that the works and the designs and the purposes of God cannot be frustrated, neither can they come to naught, for God doth not walk in crooked paths. Remember that it is not the work of God that is frustrated, but the work of men. Behold, thou art Joseph, and thou wast chosen to do the work of the Lord. But because of transgression, if thou art not aware, thou wilt fall. Nevertheless, my work shall go forth. So the revelations forbade Joseph to retranslate that 116 pages. He was told that in his boundless wisdom, however, the Lord had foreseen this contingency and had provided a set of small plates called the Plates of Nephi, which covered exactly the same period in Indian history as the lost manuscript. This record was primarily religious history, in contrast with the first version, which had been largely political. Once he had translated it, he could go back to the old plates and carry on, presumably from page 117. She goes on to have a letter in here that Joseph Smith wrote to the reader, as many false reports have been circulated respecting the following work, and also many unlawful measures taken by evil designing persons to destroy me and also the work. I would inform you that I translated by the gift and power of God and caused to be written 116 pages, the which I took from the Book of Lehi, which was an account abridged from the Plates of Lehi by the hand of Mormon. And he goes on to just talk about how Satan's power, or Satan's plan, wouldn't go, that he's not going to retranslate it because he knows that somebody's waiting for him to retranslate it and try to find something wrong with the translation. So he's not going to do it. And then it's signed to the author. In the Saints book, page 54, it said that when Joseph returned to Harmony, Moroni appeared to him again and took the plates away. He said, "If you are sufficiently humble and penitent," the angel said, "you will receive them again on the 22nd of September. The Gospel Topics essay on this tells us that the ability to translate was taken away from Joseph for a time. There's some speculation that the Urim and Thummim were taken away too, but I don't know if that's true. So the Gospel Topics essay says, Joseph began translating again in 1829, and almost all of the present Book of Mormon text was translated during a 3-month period between April and June of that year. His chief scribe during these months was Oliver Cowdery. It talks about, in her book on page 57, it talks about during this time, he just started getting revelations for everything and for everyone. She has a copy of a revelation for Joseph's father. And the interesting thing about reading this is it's just full of Bible language. It has, "Now behold, a marvelous work is about to come forth." That's from Isaiah 29:14. It then says, "The field is white, ready to harvest," John 4:35. "Thrust is in his sickle with his might, the same layeth," Revelation 14:15. "Ask and ye shall receive, knock and it shall be opened unto you," Matthew 7. She said this mosaic of extracts from Isaiah, St. John, Revelations, and St. Matthew has the ring of divinity. Thereafter, Joseph received revelations freely for his brothers, secretaries, and friends. So he's just starting to really amp up during this time period. He's going to start really translating the Book of Mormon. He's going to start having lots of revelations. So as they are writing the Book of Mormon, as they're translating it, him and Oliver Cowdery, it's important to look at what is the Book of Mormon. She says on the next page, on page 58, she brings up that about 25,000 words in the Book of Mormon consisted of passages from the Old Testament, chiefly those chapters from Isaiah mentioned in Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews, and about 2,000 more words were taken from the New Testament. You start seeing how much is in the Book of Mormon from other sources now. So we're going to go to, also on page 58, it says, "His mother for many years had cherished the details of several of her husband's dreams, and one of these the youth incorporated wholesale into his narrative. Lehi, father of the hero Nephi, was made to have a vision that paralleled the dream of Joseph's father in minute detail. And it goes through it, and here it shows the difference. I've read his full dream. I actually wrote it in, I've been doing a project where I have a modern Book of Mormon from just the last couple of years, and I have a first edition Book of Mormon, and I've been going through and marking all the changes. And so I wrote Joseph Smith Sr.'s vision or dream right next to Lehi's vision in the Book of Mormon copy that I'm doing this in. It is so interesting. He talks about a dark and dreary wilderness, a tree with fruit desirable for his whole family. He wants to have partake of it. A rod of iron that extended along the bank of a river and led to the tree. A great and spacious building filled with people, both old and young, male and female, and their manner of dress exceedingly fine. And they were in the attitude of mocking and pointing their fingers towards those who had come at and were partaking of the fruit. So those are from Lehi's vision in the Book of Mormon. So this is the dream of Joseph Smith Sr. I thought I was thus traveling in an open and desolate field which appeared very barren, a tree such as I'd never seen before. I found it delicious beyond description. As I was eating, I said in my heart, I cannot eat this alone. I must bring my wife and children. I beheld a beautiful stream of water, which ran from the east to the west. I could see a rope running along the bank of it. I beheld a spacious building, filled with people who were finely dressed. When these people observed us in the low valley under the tree, they pointed the finger of scorn at us. That sounds very much like he took his father's dream and added detail to it. Now I'm going to skip backwards to the chapter we covered last week, and because there were a few things there that I wanted to save for this subject. And that is on page 43, she talks about how the name Lehi is actually an obscure biblical name, but it was also the name of a river which ran not far south of Harmony, although that was spelled Lehigh instead of Lehi, but it's still the same name. Also, like Joseph himself, Nephi had 2 elder brothers, Laman and Lemuel, and 3 younger brothers, Sam, Jacob, and Joseph. Lemuel is also a biblical name, but also happened to be that of a neighbor, Lemuel Durfee, who signed an affidavit in 1833 charging Joseph Smith with an immoral character and vicious habits. So he might have had a vendetta against him. We also know from my video about folk magic that the Laman and the Ammon, those were things that came up in their folk magic, and those were names in the Book of Mormon. So skipping back to this chapter, on pages 62 and 63, she gives more comparisons. Many stories seem borrowed from the Bible. The daughter of Jared, like Salome, danced before a king, and a decapitation followed. Aminadai, like Daniel, deciphered handwriting on a wall. Alma was converted after the exact fashion of St. Paul. The daughters of the Lamanites were abducted, like the dancing daughters of Shiloh. And Ammon, the American counterpart of David for want of a Goliath, slew 6 sheep rustlers with his sling. If you take into account all of the things that seem to be borrowed from the Bible, the things that seem to be borrowed from his time period, if you look at a map of where he lived, it matches up with the Book of Mormon geography way better than South America or Central America do. And in fact, I know there are believing LDS people that believe in a heartland model, and I think that's probably why, but they're taking a faithful approach to that. But if you take those things into account, and then you also add in the books like View of the Hebrews, the first book of, I think it's called the First Book of Napoleon, that has so much of the same language and same stories. And the one I have, The Great War, where it is a history of the War of 1812 written in biblical language, in the King James biblical language. And there's so many passages that are almost word for word the same as passages in the Book of Mormon. And these were all, and there's more, there's other books besides those. And these are all things that he would have had access to. You start to see how someone could piece together the Book of Mormon based on things that they had encountered, legends, lore, things he was interested in, other books, the Bible, and his own imagination, which we know was big. So we know for the remainder of the Book of Mormon, it seems as if Oliver Cowdery was the main scribe. He also wanted to translate it. And in Saints, we learned that he asked for the gift of translation and tried to translate, but it didn't work out. And he wasn't able to do it. In that Gospel Topics essay, where it says most of the Book of Mormon was written during this time, during these few months with Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris tells a little bit of a different story. He says that at least 1/3 of the published Book of Mormon that he was the scribe for. So there's really no way to know that either, but that's what he says. So how was it translated? We've talked about this with the Seer Stone. In the Gospel Topics essay, it says, in the preface to the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith wrote, I would inform you that I translated the book by the gift and power of God. When pressed for specifics about the process of translation, Joseph repeated on several occasions that it had been done by the gift and power of God. and once added, it was not intended to tell the world all the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. David Whitmer, who was an important church member in the early days and was a friend of Oliver Cowdery, came to visit. And I have found this account in many sources, not just Fawn Brodie's book, but this is what he said. Joseph Smith would put the seer stone into a hat and put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light. And in the darkness, the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English. Brother Joseph would read off the English to Oliver Cowdery, who was his principal scribe. And when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph to see if it was correct, then it would disappear, and another character with the interpretation would appear. Thus the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God and not by any power of man. So he's echoing what the Gospel Topics essay said of it being the power of God. However, one very important thing in his testimony is he's telling about the rock in the hat, right? And that's something, again, we didn't learn for a very long time. And now they're starting to say, hey, everybody, he used the rock for lots of things. Yay, hat. Rock in the hat. It's perfect. There's nothing weird about that. But it is not what we were taught, ever. And the other very interesting thing about his testimony is that he said that the words would appear, that Oliver Cowdery would read them back, and if they were correct, then it would move on. So it wouldn't move on until they were correct. If that is the case, then the Book of Mormon should never have changed. And I just told you about a study I've been doing with the first edition Book of Mormon and a modern Book of Mormon, and I will make a video about that eventually whenever I finish. But there have been so many changes. And a lot of people will say, yeah, sure, but their grammar, spelling, things like that. And yeah, that is a lot of them. But there have been whole sentences that have changed. There have been whole phrases that have been changed. There's tenses that changed the entire meaning of what is being said. And I have actually been surprised a few times by the things that have changed. So I will be excited to share that whenever I do finish it. But it just goes to show that if his account is correct, there never should have been any changes. Now, knowing what we know now about the rock in the hat, in Saints, on page 61, it says, sometimes Joseph translated by looking through the interpreters and reading in English the characters on the plates. Often, he found a single seer stone to be more convenient. He would put the seer stone in his hat, place his face into the hat to block out the light, and peer at the stone. Light from the stone would shine in the darkness, revealing words that Joseph dictated as Oliver rapidly copied them down. Under the Lord's direction, Joseph did not try to retranslate what had been lost. So again, there it is telling us it was usually the rock in the hat, but they're trying to say, well, sometimes it was the Urim and Thummim, because that's what we were taught for so long. And I really believed he was sitting there with those plates, put on those little glasses, like in National Treasure when he puts on the glasses and sees extra things, that he was doing that and he was seeing the words. That's what I believed growing up. In the Gospel Topics essay, it says, the other instrument which Joseph Smith discovered in the ground years before he retrieved the gold plates was a small oval stone or seer stone. As a young man during the 1820s, Joseph Smith, like others in his day, used the seer stone to look for lost objects and buried treasure. As Joseph grew to understand his prophetic calling, he learned that he could use this stone for the higher purpose of translating scripture. Again, that's the same tactic we talked about in a previous video of making sure they throw that in there like others in his day to make it not seem so weird. They also go on to say that in ancient times, Israelite priests used the Urim and Thummim to assist in receiving divine communications. Although the commentators differ on the nature of the instrument, several ancient sources state that the instrument involved stones that lit up and were divinely illuminated. They have a footnote to that. If you follow that, it goes to a book that's about mythology and medieval tales, which is kind of funny. But they're always trying to bring in others of his day and the Bible. They're totally different things. Latter-day Saints later understood the term Urim and Thummim to refer exclusively to the interpreters, but Joseph Smith and others, however, seem to have understood the term more as a descriptive category of instruments for obtaining divine revelation and less as the name of a specific instrument. Right there in this Gospel Topics essay, they are setting you up so that when you have been taught your whole life it was the Urim and Thummim, they can say, oh, we meant the seer stone when we said that. But the funny thing about all of this is that now that they are admitting about the rock in the hat, the seer stone in the hat, we have to go back a little bit in church history. So I'm going to read a quote from Joseph Fielding Smith. He was the 10th president of the church. While he admitted that Joseph Smith had a stone, this is what he said. While the statement has been made by some writers that the prophet Joseph Smith used a seer stone, part of the time in his translating of the record and information points to the fact that he did have in his possession such a stone, yet there is no authentic statement in the history of the church which states that the use of such a stone was made in that translation. The information is all hearsay, and personally I do not believe that this stone was used for this purpose. It hardly seems reasonable to suppose that the prophet would substitute something evidently inferior under these circumstances. It may have been so, but it is so easy for a story of this kind to be circulated due to the fact that the prophet did possess a seer stone, which he may have used for some other purposes. As if he didn't know what those other purposes were at the time, but also he believed it was hearsay. That didn't happen. He didn't believe it. He's a prophet. We're told the prophets know everything. At least that's what the general idea is, right? But it hardly seems reasonable that he would substitute something. That is what I wanted you to remember from earlier, is that those stones that were with the plates were said to have been put there specifically because God specifically prepared those for the translation of these plates. Why would those have been specially prepared and kept safe all of those years to not use them? For that matter, why would the plates be preserved and all of that painstaking work of writing it down and protecting those plates and him having to go get them and all that if he wasn't even looking at them to translate? All right, so going back to the Gospel Topics essay, they say Joseph Smith and his scribes wrote of 2 instruments used in translating the Book of Mormon. According to witnesses of the translation, when Joseph looked into the instruments, the words of Scripture appeared in English. One instrument, called in the Book of Mormon the Interpreters, is better known to Latter-day Saints today as the Urim and Thummim. Joseph found the interpreters buried in a hill with the plates. Those who saw the interpreters described them as a clear pair of stones bound together with a metal rim. Based on everything I've seen, no one actually saw them. So it says those who saw them, but I don't think anybody actually saw them with their physical eyes. They felt them through a handkerchief or they saw them with their spiritual eyes. We'll go back to that when we talk about the witnesses. But if you know different, let me know in the comments below. Another interesting point to bring up here is they talk as if the Urim and Thummim were just the things that were used the most. They were the most well-known thing. And growing up, that is what I was taught. But I read recently that the Urim and Thummim weren't even mentioned until W. Phelps brought them up in 1832. And that originally in the Doctrine and Covenants, that they weren't mentioned in the Revelation about them, that those words weren't even there. I also have a first edition Book of Commandments that were the Doctrine and Covenants, and I immediately went to check, and it's true. Where in the modern day Doctrine and Covenants, where it says, I should have had that with me, but I don't. And I'll show it to you later in another video. Where it says the Urim and Thummim, in the original, it does not say that. There's no mention of them. I have another quote from Bruce R. McConkie. He was in the first council of the 70 of the church. He made this statement about the seer stone. The prophet also had a seer stone, which was separate and distinct from the Urim and Thummim, and which, speaking loosely, has been called by some a Urim and Thummim. So again, that goes back to the idea that if you've read Urim and Thummim, if you've been taught Urim and Thummim, we've been teaching you about the seer stone all along because sometimes it was called that. Now, if you remember in another video, I talked about Captain Kidd, that pirate. And William R. Hine said that Joseph Smith translated characters through the stone before he brought forth the Book of Mormon. He said that he saw Captain Kidd sailing on the Susquehanna River during a freshet and that he buried 2 pots of gold and silver. He claimed that he saw writing cut on the rocks in an unknown language telling where Kidd buried it, and he translated it through his peepstone. That one is hearsay. That is, I don't know if that guy's telling the truth, but it does bring back in that Captain Kidd connection and him saying, hey, I can read something because of my peepstone. I know a lot of people have a lot of arguments against the CES letter that they can use, and that there's some things that maybe are speculation in it and stuff like that. But that is the first place I learned about the stone in the hat. And for some people, the first place was the South Park episode, the cartoon, and nobody believed it. And when I read it in the CES letter first, I didn't believe it either. And so that's when I went and searched on the church website and found out it was true. In the CES letter, Jeremy Reynolds has this quote. In 2000, 2 BYU religion professors, Joseph Fielding McConkie, son of Elder Bruce R. McConkie, and Craig J. Osler wrote an essay titled The Process of Translating the Book of Mormon. They wrote, thus, everything we have in the Book of Mormon, according to Mr. Whitmer, was translated by placing the chocolate-colored stone in a hat into which Joseph would bury his head so as to close out the light. While doing so, he could see an oblong piece of parchment on which the hieroglyphics would appear, and below the ancient writing, the translation would be given in English. Joseph would then read this to Oliver Cowdery, who in turn would write it. If he did so correctly, the characters in the interpretation would disappear and be replaced by other characters with their interpretation. After laying this groundwork, he says that the professors continued, If Joseph Smith translated everything that is now in the Book of Mormon without using the gold plates, we are left to wonder why the plates were necessary in the first place, which is what I said a minute ago. It will be remembered that possession of the plates placed the Smith family in considerable danger, causing them a host of difficulties. If the plates were not part of the translation process, this would not have been the case. It also leaves us wondering why the Lord directed the writers of the Book of Mormon to take a duplicate record of the plates of Lehi. This provision, which compensated for the loss of the 116 pages, would have served no purpose either. Further, we would be left to wonder why it was necessary for Moroni to instruct Joseph each year for 4 years before he was entrusted with the plates. We would also wonder why it was important for Moroni to show the plates to the 3 witnesses, including David Whitmer. And why did the Lord have the prophet show the plates to the 8 witnesses? And of course, we'll get into that again in the next video. Why all this flap and fuss if the prophet didn't really have the plates and if they were not used in the process of translation? What David Whitmer is asking us to believe is that the Lord had Moroni seal up the plates and the means by which they were to be translated hundreds of years before they would come into Joseph Smith's possession, and then decided to have the prophet use a seer stone found while digging a well so that none of those things would be necessary after all. Is this, we would ask, really a credible explanation of the way the heavens operate? And the reason he brought this up in the CES letter is because he was saying that people always were saying, oh, the information was there all along, you should have known this, which I have gotten too. And so he responded to that, well, how could it have been expected of me and any other member to know about and to embrace the Rock in the Hat translation when even these 2 faithful full-time professors of religion at BYU rejected it as a fictitious lie meant to undermine Joseph Smith and the truth claims of the Restoration? And I felt like that was a really important message to bring up. Back to the book, on page 61, she said that compared with the snail's pace at which the lost 116 pages had been written, the speed with which Joseph now dictated to Cowdery was phenomenal. They began working together on April 7th, 1829, and the 275,000-word manuscript was finished by the first week in July. Mormons have maintained that the volume was written in 75 working days. This would mean an average of 3,700 words a day, if one includes the 27,000 words he quoted directly from the Bible. This accomplishment, it has been said, was far beyond his natural ability to achieve. So was it? Is that impossible to have written it that fast? In the Gospel Topics essay, again, it says, the young man, however, had very little formal education and was incapable of writing a book on his own, let alone translating an ancient book written from an unknown language known in the Book of Mormon as Reformed Egyptian. Joseph's wife, Emma, insisted that at the time of translation, Joseph could neither write nor dictate a coherent and well-worded letter, let alone dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. There's a couple of problems with this. One is that Emma said that, but she also said that he was never a polygamist. So the evidence is outstanding of his polygamy, and the church admits it. So the fact that she denied that he was a polygamist, even though she knew he was, I don't know if I can take her word for it that he could not have written it. Also, I know that the grammar in the Book of Mormon originally was really bad. And when I'm reading it in the original first edition, most of the words that have been changed that are updated grammar, if you read it in the original grammar, it sounds like the way Joseph would have spoken. Second, this is another one of those areas of proof that they try to downplay his intelligence. They constantly want us to think he was an uneducated farm boy. He was not smart enough to do this. Why anyone wants to do that to the person that they are looking up to and want to be a prophet, I don't understand. But it always bothers me. Educated does not mean intelligent. Uneducated does not mean stupid. Someone can be brilliant without having a modern education. And for a few examples of this, Philemon Stewart, a member of the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, also known as the Shakers, he made the sacred roll and book. He claims it was dictated by an angel, and part 1 was over 400 pages long and dictated in only 14 days. It was dictated in public before witnesses. Martin Harris was one of the witnesses of the book and the angel. Also, we could talk about James Strang. James Strang was an early Mormon convert who claimed to have been appointed as Joseph Smith's successor. Most members of the modern LDS Church might be surprised to learn that upon Joseph's death, a large contingent of the church, numbering in the thousands, followed Strang rather than Brigham Young. These included those saints who did not want to participate in polygamy and those who still desired to follow a prophet, a calling to which Brigham initially made no claims. Strang, on the other hand, declared that he communed with angels, including Moroni, who showed him the location of buried ancient metal plates. Among those who followed Strang were Emma Smith and her children, Joseph's mother Lucy, Joseph's only living brother William, all of the living members of the 8 witnesses, and the 3 witnesses except for Oliver Cowdery, who moved near to the Strangite community but never officially joined. Like Joseph Smith, Strang had 11 eyewitnesses of his plates, and although he had only a grade school education, Strang translated the contents of 2 sets of plates by the gift and power of God and produced the Vori record and the Book of Law of the Lord. The resulting texts contain many of the same Hebraisms that we find in the Book of Mormon. And that comes from strangite.org. And I found it from LDS Discussions. He also said, Joseph's own mother, Lucy Mack Smith, is another excellent example. Despite having no formal education but having access to the exact same resources as her son, Lucy wrote a very intelligent and complex 500-page book, which she produced by dictating to a scribe. And also from LDS Discussions, I found this quote. William McClellan said of Joseph, he attended my high school during the winter of 1834. He attended and learned science all winter. I learned the strength of his mind as to the study and principles of science. Hence, I think I knew him, and I hear say that he had one of the strongest, well-balanced, penetrating, and retentive minds of any man with whom I've ever formed an acquaintance, among the thousands of my observation. Although, when I took him into my school, he was without scientific knowledge or attainments. And that was printed in Deseret News, January 28, 2009. I think it is very safe to say that Joseph Smith probably was very intelligent and probably had an amazing memory. And we know he had a great imagination. All right, to finish up this video, we're going to go to page 63, where this takes a little bit of a turn. And I wasn't sure if I should add this in with this video since it's not about the translation anymore, but I didn't really want to do a whole video just on this part. So at the end of this chapter, page 63, she talks about a printing press that was burned and its owner beaten by a group of masked men. In the press office were fresh proofs of a new book, an expose on the secret rites and oaths of Freemasonry. The author, William Morgan, was abducted some days later and carried to Canandaigua, 9 miles from Joseph Smith's home, for a mock trial. He was then taken secretly to Fort Niagara on the Canadian border, where he disappeared. 5 prominent Masons in Canandaigua were tried for his murder in January 1827. And over the next few pages, she talks about how the churches were dismissing pastors who would not renounce Masonry. And there were 19 anti-Masonic conventions within 12 months. Democrats were worried that Andrew Jackson was going to lose the election because he was a Mason of high rank. Masonry was being denounced everywhere. And in the Book of Mormon, there is a Gadianton band, a secret society whose oaths for fraternal protection were bald parallels of Masonic oaths, and whose avowed aim was the overthrow of the democratic Nephite government. Like the Masons, the Gadiantons claimed to derive their secrets from Tubal-Cain. And I found that really interesting because she's talking about how so much of that in the Book of Mormon can be looked at as anti-Masonic stuff because it was during that time period. The reason I find that so interesting is something we will go into much later, that Joseph Smith would become a Mason, and the Masonry vows and rituals will end up showing up in our temples, and we still do them today. So I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope you learned something or found it interesting. If you have anything to add, please leave a comment. And next week I will be discussing the witnesses.